Hello. Good evening. I'm Todd Gannon, and I am very happy to welcome tonight's guest, Florian Idenburg. With his partner, Jing Liu, Florian leads the award-winning Brooklyn-based practice of SOIL. SOIL stands for Solid Objectives, Idenburg View, but I'm fairly certain, and Florian can confirm this when we get going, but I'm fairly certain that the faint echo those of us old enough hear of another Brooklyn institution, the Beastie Boys, is not an accident. I'm not going to tell you how much time I wasted this afternoon trying to build a SOIL theory out of the Beastie Boys catalog. I'm convinced, Florian, that it can be done. The way that the Beastie Boys rearrange the acoustical DNA of the material they sample on Paul's Boutique, for instance, directly resonates with the way that Jing and Florian approach precedence. But I'll save that conversation for another time. Maybe we'll get into it a little bit after the talk. But for now, I just want to help those of you who are not familiar with SOIL to understand a bit about where they came from and why I believe they're one of the most important practices operating in architecture today. Florian was born in the Netherlands and graduated from the TU Delft in 1999. He joined the Tokyo-based office of Sana the following year, and before long, he was managing the firm's major projects in the US, the Glass Museum in Toledo and the New Museum in New York. Upon completing the latter project, he launched SOIL with Jing, who was born in China, was educated there, as well as in Japan, the UK, and at Tulane here at the US, and had previously worked with KPF in New York. Projects came to the firm relatively quickly, and before long, they were building at an impressive scale. I'll let Florian take you through the projects themselves, but I'll point out there are two monographs for a very young firm. One, two, Order Edge Aura, published by Lars Mueller, and Unfinished Business, published by A+U last year. By 2010, SOIL had won the PS1 competition at MoMA and the AIA's New Practices Award. 2 years later, they were named among 2013's Emerging Voices by the Architectural League of New York. A year after that, they won the Prix de Rome, then the Wilczek Prize, then last year, the Miller Prize. You get the idea. They're also committed teachers. Florian is now teaching at Cornell University in Ithaca, and Jing is at Columbia University in New York. Now, I first met Florian in 2008. When we were planning the firm's exhibition Future Archaeology at the LA Forum Gallery in Hollywood. Back then, I was on the board of the LA Forum, and we'd just acquired and renovated a grungy space on Hollywood Boulevard with an installation by the Euler-Wu Collaborative. Since we had no money, we wore that space's DIY grunginess like a badge of honor, and Dwayne and Jenny's custom welded overhead apparatus fit our sensibility perfectly. Now, Jing and Florian came in with a proposal that didn't seem even remotely possible, given the budget that we had to work with. Their plan was to fold the pendulum plane tight to the ceiling, frame in their own ceiling beneath it, install about 1 million fluorescent lights, paint everything white, and basically erase the lovable grunginess of our gallery, along with all trace of Euler-Wu's installation. Now, I was skeptical. I admit I was maybe a little irritated, but then I showed up one day when the installation was nearing completion. Our grungy gallery had been replaced by an impossibly elegant space. You can see it now. Ewan Bond's photographs might seem a little exaggerated, but they are not. That installation was stunning. And it hit me then. And SOIL's work ever since has only reinforced my feelings that these two knew how to make the impossible possible. And for me, it's that consistent ability to wring architectural possibilities out of situations that at first might seem incapable of supporting them that makes SOIL so important and so much fun to follow. Now, I've got all sorts of other stuff that we can talk about, and I hope we'll be able to get into that tonight. But for now, I'm going to stop talking because I want to hear Florian. So all of you at home, please welcome Florian Idenburg. Take it away, Florian.
Oh, thank you. That's a very nice introduction. a lot already to respond to. I would say, apart from the Beastie Boys, it's also Christopher Wallace, also known as the Notorious B.I.G., that drew me to Brooklyn. And it's true. There is a theory there which has not been explored, but I think that's one of the reasons why we ended up in Brooklyn and why I thought So Ill was a very good place to start, so to say. So here we are in our office. I will start I will share my screen now, Zach, so you know it's coming. Let's see. I have to say, can you see my screen? I think you can. Here we are with our office just before COVID on the roof of our office in our bubble. And so I think you see Jing in the foreground. Obviously, what I will be talking about is not stuff that I authored solo. I did it together with Jing, but also with a big team, and not just our team of colleagues here in the office, but also obviously consultants, and very importantly, also the people that make our work, you know, the laborers, the manufacturers, the suppliers, and we will speak about that as well a little bit. I just put it back in there, Todd. I thought it would be great to indeed show you this space, and I think so. We started in 2008. In 2009, we did this sort of somewhat early retrospective, a year in, but it really you know, set us on sort of a very exciting track and an exciting pace. And we've always been very interested in sort of the pliable and the elastic. Experimenting and seeing how, you know, one would live in a sort of emergent and sort of dynamic context in which things and people act and behave in ways that we even ourselves could not anticipate. We like to bend and ply and shrink wrap and extrude and pull and bend, not just in models, but also with the material itself. Sometimes things that you know, succeed, sometimes things that fail, and that sort of embrace of the reality of the context in which we operate, the world in which we operate. So not just sort of the pristine gallery, but also storefront here for art and architecture one day after we installed it. And so we've been always interested in some way in a certain process, in a certain indeterminacy, and sort of embracing how things fall, so to say. And in that, also maybe a certain mystery, maybe, or a certain mystique that can appear. And so one example, the gallery in Korea that is maybe well published, where we're not interested necessarily in the digital form, the precision of this form, but much more in sort of translating this form then into a process in which we go, you know, to the other side of the world and work with a village to weld 500 rings together to make this sort of custom jacket, this custom drape. Or for instance, in Hong Kong, where there's an interest in sort of refraction and depth of a facade that needs to sit in the center of the Hong Kong harbor, we're then in a very different process. We end up in a factory in southern Germany. You couldn't be more far away from the village in China. And then with sort of alpine type construction, hang 400 tubes on this sort of you know, podium on the harbor front of Hong Kong. And so I think that idea of the elasticity and the idea of the pliable, but also sort of the experimentation has led us currently to a sort of broader and more involved practice, so to say, wherein we're not just drawing lines, so to say, but there's many strings attached. And in some way, what I want to talk about today is 4 projects that are in the studio at this moment or just finished just recently. Todd showed you the unfinished business. So these are the projects that are about to finish or are finishing now. And I want to talk not just about sort of the architectural ideas, but everything that comes with it once you go into the world and work, you know, with a wider range of people, also on sort of more complex and more involved projects. So I'm going to start with one of the largest projects we've been working on, and maybe one of the most complex and one of the longest lasting. So where we started with temporary and quick installations, currently we're working on something that will, well, that could take forever, so to say, and that makes us really think about time and a project in a very different way. This is the Niagara Gorge, the Niagara Falls, the border between Canada and the US, and we're involved here in a strategic master plan for Art Park, which at least should take 30 years. And I want to talk about this project because it made us think very differently about the way we as architects actually operate on, within the world and on the world, if you want. Specifically here, it is something that has a lot to do with the soil, with the earth, and literally with the planet. The Niagara Falls is old, as you can imagine, but it has not always been at the same spot. And so this is an old map from the 30s, like mid-30s, that shows the Niagara Gorge. It's a tourist map, and it tries to attract people to take a train line down the Niagara Gorge. 10,000 years ago, the Niagara Gorge, the Niagara Falls were over here, up here. Just over 10,000 years, it has sort of gradually moved upstream, so to say, as it is carving away the soil, and that's how the gorge came to being. And so that section that exists there is something that is created and shaped over time by the water. You see from this map that there was a very particular attitude with regards to First Nation inhabitants of this place, and that's another part of this story as well that adds to the complexity and the interest. So this is the site where we're talking about, which is in Lewiston. That was, it burned in 1813. It was earlier. It was constructed. It has never been there for a long time. It also was the place where there was the Kinuka First Nation village. There was a bridge here, and this is where the train sort of came by. But you see sort of how the site sort of is a drop in two plateaus. And the story of Art Park, which is the park we are currently working on and have developed this master plan for, in some way found its origin in 1956 when a power plant collapsed. The Niagara Gorge, apart from a beautiful site, is also one of the main places for all the energy in New York State, and it generates an incredible amount of hydropower. And here we are right after World War II, when America was like growing and booming, the post-war sort of boom, and there was a lot of manufacturing happening out in the north and western New York area. There was a lot of, and obviously also there in Ohio. A lot of the manufacturer relied on the hydropower, and when this power plant collapsed, suddenly the state was without power. Rockefeller, who was then the governor, who, as you can see from his plaza in Albany, was a guy who liked to use the modernist hand to create and to control, so to say, his destiny, got in Mr. Power Broker himself, Robert Moses, to build the Niagara Power Project. And within 3 years, they were able to open the largest hydropower station in the Western Hemisphere that he created, and the power could be turned on, and the manufacturing stayed, and the economy soared again. But in order for Robert Moses to create this very large power plant, he had to dig a very large lake. And this lake was situated on the land of two First Nations, the Tuscarora Nation and the nation I mentioned before. And there was a large protest, of course, because they actually had to disown their land in order to build this power station. As you see here, the Tuscarora village is right at our site. They took it to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court ruled that it was more important that New York got its power than that they remained the rightful owners of their land. In that displacement, and here you see the lake, here you see our site of Art Park, all the soil was dumped there. The site of this excavation was dumped on this site, which ultimately became our site. Here you see the power plant. What you also see is that the Niagara Falls storage site was there. That was waste from the Manhattan project. So there was like nuclear waste stored there as well. And there was a lot of earth moving, and there's always a lot of earth moving in this part of the state. And so there was some suspense that actually some of that waste might have been also mixed with the soil that was being dumped here on this site in Lewiston. Here you see the lake, here you see the backfill. They used this road, and you see the road that was used by the trucks to fill up sort of this backfill, which is basically a landfill of soil and waste. as they were dumping the land, they also recognized there is a mound from the Hopewell Nation, a burial mound, which is now part of the park as well, and was just spared. You see here the mound. This is the mound over here, and you see how the backfill happened and how it just sort of edges this the mound. And so what happened after that is Rockefeller, and so the New York Power Authority is the owner of this site, so to say. They are responsible for this land and responsible for the soil and the backfill. Rockefeller then made a budget available to bring artists in. And this is the moment in art in New York where the artists start to leave the studio. They start to go west to the Nevada desert, and land art sort of emerges. But not everybody could afford buying a crater or taking over a large part of the desert. And many of the artists in New York, they moved here. And in some way, Art Park, as it was renamed, was the birthplace of land art and of environmental art. And there's a number of very important pieces. So, for instance, Gordon Matta Clark in some way reenacted the hydro station collapsing down the gorge. Here on the right, a performance piece. Also, there were a lot of artists really dealing with that depth, so to say, of that gorge. Nancy Holt, which is Robert Smithson's widow, where she survived when he fell out of the helicopter. She did work there with the soil. Also, more architecturally, Ant Farm, they actually captured one of their time capsules there that now we cannot unearth because there might be uranium in the ground. And the most maybe violent and most expressive and most aggressive, say, form of land art was probably Chris Burden's Beam Drop, who had a big pool of concrete and then with big cranes, let steel beams drop into our planet, so to say. And so the land there is not a beautiful romantic piece of landscape. It is soil, it's a pile, and it is being worked and reworked, and it has these layers and layers of history. After 84, the more experimental phase stopped, and it became a more sort of destination for community art. There was a performance amphitheater built for concerts. There was this sort of Art L, as it was called, where a lot of classrooms were given. And then one of the local politicians, he loved opera, so he wanted to have a 2,500 seat theater there in a town of 2,000. They ran out of money, so they couldn't insulate it, which is not a great idea for Buffalo, New York. It's still there, and it's very hard to use. But in those days, it was a very successful place, and many of the local residents loved it and had like one of their best experiences there. And for anybody you ask, who is of a certain age, Art Park was an important site. Now, fast forward a number of years, the funding dried up. There is no more Rockefeller. There's no more experimental art. Land art has shifted. Now there's environmental art, but not on this site. And so in some way, the site is still there with all these layers of history and all these different sort of sediments, so to say. But in some way, it has lost its pulse. And so we were called in through a competition and an interview together with West 8, the landscape designers, and Charcoal Blue, who do theater and venue design to make a master plan. And how do you do a master plan after so much has happened to a site? First of all, we don't really believe in masters. Maybe we believe somewhat in plans, but we also very much believe in processes rather than plans. The plan sort of suggests that you know what will happen. And I think for us, specifically a project like this, we wanted to approach in a different way. We visited the site. It's beautiful. You see the gorge. You see the sort of depth, the section of the landscape. It's intimate, and at the same time, higher up, you have this expanse. At some points, you can see Toronto at the horizon in Canada. But in many ways, it is sort of a quite empty and very inactivated and sleepy site. Only once, or basically 12 times a year, it's still used for classic rock concerts. And the director, told us, there's a problem. The audience is dying. The acts are dying. What should we do? We visited Sammy Hagar. He at 72 says, we need to do something. He brought Jason Bonham, the son of John Bonham, in, but still it is a very particular usage, which only happens and only activates a few, so to say. So we started to just listen, and we started to listen to the people, who had a great time there, and they were just reminiscing of how can we bring back that old energy, that the art park had. But we also toured the site with representatives of the First Nation, the Tuscarora Nation, and they had a very different approach. They said, we don't want you to recognize that that this is our land. We want actually you to not touch it and be respectful and not plan, certainly not touch, certainly not dig, certainly not unearth anything that is here, and just let it be, so to say. Specifically, the Mount and some other areas that were, really off guard, so to say. And so instead of a plan and adding another layer, so to say, we thought, why don't we work with a series of possibilities, of options, of sort of interventions that could be done, that not sort of, put another layer on top of it, but actually unearth in a way these histories and make these histories accessible and understandable. And so we started with a number of vignettes that sort of speak about sort of this idea of the layering of all these different histories, and how can we frame them, reframe them, how can we have the visitor sort of go not only down in section, but also in a way in time through these different layers. How can we frame the sites that have a certain meaning? And also, how do we work really with this artificiality of the ground? And how do we make this clear to the visitor that this is not a beautiful or sort of, romantic, centuries old, or what is it, millions of years old natural site, but it is one that is very artificial, that is very much man-made, that is very much created through technology, and where sort of that aspect, and even the aspect that it is owned by the power authority, and that it is part of a sort of infrastructural impulse. How do we make that part of the reading of the site so that we can talk about it and that the visitor can learn about it? And so I will not show all of these interventions, but there's two things that I want to highlight that we are now working on there moving forward. One is the main organizing spine of the path. And what we do is we actually bring back, we sort of reintroduce and highlight in my red, making it out of red brick pavers, permeable pavers, the route that the trucks drove to dump the earth. And so the organizational spine of the path is actually the same route that these trucks, took down the hill when they were dumping their trucks. And it sort of comes through here. You see the spine. It comes through this renewed amphitheater. One of the first things we needed to do in order for Art Park to survive, so to say, is to reorganize your amphitheater, improve sort of its sidelines, and make it a year-long venue again, because many bands and many acts were not wanting to play here anymore. So this first project that we're now pushing forward is the reconstruction and the sort of upgrade, so to say, of the amphitheater. And so we wanted to work on this idea of the artificial landscape and almost thinking of this not by sort of excavating, but actually by adding sort of a number of artificial hills that are in themselves, when nothing is going on, a very attractive and maybe somewhat surreal landscape. And then at the same time, when there is an event, it can be used as a way to watch it, to see what is going on. And so we worked with West 8 to create these artificial knolls, these artificial hills, that together then become sort of the amphitheater. They shape sort of this vineyard seating 10,000 people amphitheater that sort of graze the hill along the gorge with a view towards the water as you come down, and you see the red spine sort of going through. Here you see it in section, here you see it in plan when nothing is happening, and here you see it when sort of the events happen, so to say. So the first part is really sort of a fixed stage, but the rest is really hills that are also fun to sit on and picnic, maybe when you see sort of when nothing is going on. And for the band shell, and this is sort of the first project, we wanted to work with a somewhat futuristic and somewhat maybe experimental structure, which is a tensegrity structure that then gets draped with this sort of skin that actually generates through the sun energy that helps sort of the amplification of the music, because you'll be surprised how much energy a live stage and a live concert actually takes. And so the idea is that we would run the entire concert on sort of renewable power by both tapping into the hydropower, but also generating energy through the band shell itself. As a first sort of teaser, we recently reinstalled an installation that we had done for the High Museum in Atlanta last year, Murmuration. It just landed last month and it opened on site there as a first step in this ongoing project, which probably is going to take three decades. I know I'm trying to keep the pace so that Todd and I can still have a conversation, so I'll switch from a very one countryside to the next. This one is northern France, near Strasbourg, so really at the border of Germany, in an area that is throughout history has been both part of France and sometimes of Germany. Meisenthal in the Vosges. It's a hilly, beautiful, and wooded landscape. And this landscape was a very important site for the birth, or for, at least within this region, glass making and sort of the glass craft. And it used to be a nomadic trade. So there were families that basically lived in the forest, and they moved through the forest and they made glass. They built little huts in which they blew glass, but it was sort of a nomadic type of activity where they went from source to source, always reliant on the soil, on the wood to burn, on the water, and obviously the air to blow. So the elements were very important. And at some point in this town near Strasbourg, they started in a town called Meisenthal. One of the families, three brothers, they settled down and they started this glass making facility. This is in the 16 and 1700s. And so in 1700, they started the sort of family company, and this is one of the longest lasting glass companies, Meisenthal, in this town that has ever existed. In 1969, it went out of business because of different manufacturing techniques and different, basically the way the world transformed, and the factory closed. But so over time, the morphology of this site is one of addition, erasure, removal, sort of the morphology through sort of the different layers of time that are very clearly sort of legible and present on the site. This is not today. This is 6 years ago when we were invited to do a competition. And here you see, how we found the site in this bucolic landscape. Within the center, the old factory, which was really the factory, the town square. You see the church is even off-site here. The factory was sort of the de facto square. Here, the yard of the factory is where the entire community came together. When we came there were three different organizations using the facilities. So in the big old hall, there were concerts, again, mostly regional concerts up to 5,000 people. Then there is a glass blowing facility here, where actually quite good artisans from around the Europe come to do glasswork and blow glass in a studio setting. And then there was here the old sort of office building of the company, which is now a museum for the history of this town and the history of the region and the history of this factory. And then some ruins over here. And so the job was actually to transform these independent organizations into a centralized center for glass that bring these three, just completely independent and separately operating organizations under one roof, so to say. And so we thought of these four elements and the sort of very, elemental aspects, right, of the making of glass. And in some way, even thinking about wait, I'm like completely blanking on the word, but basically through the idea of the earth becoming molten, so to say, and shapeable. And so we started to think of these layers of history and those layers of time and the pliability in a way of that sediment. And we thought, rather than under one roof, what if we organize these three organizations under one ground, if you want, or on one ground? There was a different topography. The buildings were at different heights. And so we thought, what if we sort of make it almost like a picnic blanket and we put these different organizations on the same ground. And then we had it spread over this old ruin, which then we turned into the entrance pavilion, where there's both the cafe and the education space and a little store. And so you enter now under this new topography, if you want, over here into the new square. The entrance to, because we needed to make like new dressing rooms and toilets and everything happen here under the, on the lower level, and the same, a new entrance to the museum on the lower level, and the sort of undulating plane provides accessibility to all the different parts of the compound. We reclad one of the structures and we build a double in a way as new glass studios. You see them over here. This is sort of the upper level of the ground, so to say. And I think here's the map of the sort of under level. And so here you see the new entrances, the dressing rooms and the backstage area, the entrance to the museum, the entrance to the store and the education facilities, and here the entrance of the museum, or of the glass studios itself. And so now, and this is about to open in January, when you come to town, you sort of see, the sort of really quite interesting additions and material sort of pile up, so to say, of different eras, so to say. And suddenly this building sort of appears, juxtaposed, the old and the new, but it's not just the old and the new, because it's a constant sort of evolving, series of additions and removals that have happened to the site, over time. And this is ours is just sort of the last in an ongoing process. And so the theme, even at this site, of the history continues in the history, sort of flows, and you see in the way the layers come together, sort of this build up. This is the entrance you see under the slab, if you want, and you come into this old square. We kept the old train tracks that were used to bring the wood, basically, that was used to heat the ovens in. Here you see the old building and the two new glass studios. One is poured in place concrete, the other is a reclap. So it's precast concrete. Here the entry to the music venue. Looking the other way, this is where the cafe and the store is, with the education spaces above. There's ways to get up and under the slab. Here's the entrance to the museum. And so this sort of engagement and sort of being close to this sort of layers, so to say, of material and time, and then being able to go up and look back at it, make a very dynamic and very sort of communal new experience. Put these and also higher levels, connecting them with each other. So this is still not 100% done. These pictures were taken maybe a month ago, and the final renovation of the museum here will be the final thing. We inserted a black box theater in the performance space, which is very flexible. So one way it's like a completely closed space for 250 people seated, but then the stage can move to the back and it can open towards this big hall, which you see there in the back. And so the stage, sometimes they can play the other way around, and there's 5,000 people in the audience of the old factory hall. And here you see the glass shops and their theme of the history continuing. So from northern France, there's two more stories I have to tell you, with all the strings that are attached. We're going to Mexico. We're going to the city of León, which is 3 hours north of Mexico City, in which we were asked to think about and respond to a complex issue, which is housing, generally affordable housing in Mexico. In Mexico, if you know it a little bit, there is a large population of informal housing. A large part of the population lives in sort of unregistered homes, so to say, just because there's no access, they don't have financial access to the housing market, and because people can build on public land without necessarily being removed. And so there is this question of how can we help or make these people part of the formalized housing reality. And this is something that Infonavit, one of the largest lenders in Latin America had as a task, and it produced a certain type of mortgage that then sort of produced these kind of homes, and millions of these kind of homes, which were very far outside of the city, which were very efficient, simple boxes where everybody could have one box, but it had to be in such a tight budget scenario for it to work financially, that these were very poorly constructed, often extremely far removed from the city centers. And because of that, very hard for the cities to take care of, to maintain, to bring schools to pick up the trash, to bring, to offer security and transportation. And so on a national level, it was maybe a great effort, but it really produced a lot of problems on local level because cities started to spread out extremely far, and mayors didn't know how to help and how to keep these settlements sort of alive, so to say. There was a lot of foreclosure, a lot of people that ended up not, like sort of ghost type town. León, Mexico, which is one of the fastest growing cities in Mexico. It's north of Mexico City by 3 hours, as I mentioned, in a very strong sort of economic area where a lot of car manufacturing has moved to. So where Detroit, it was shrinking, León in some way is growing, and it's attracting a lot of informal labor that work in the car factories that built their own homes around them at the periphery of the city. And through somebody who had seen a project we had designed in New York, they asked us to come and help them think or rethink or basically workshop how we could figure out how to build a new typology that could be built closer to the city center, closer to jobs, schools, transportation, and services, but at the same time, sort of in that same price range, so something that would remain affordable and would be available to the people who couldn't afford something prior in the city center. And so rather than so we were asked to organize a day of how to tackle this problem. Rather than giving a lot of lectures, we designed a game, and we asked the organization for 2 sites, and we brought glue and foam and pieces of and scissors, and we gave everybody there who were like the stakeholders, so the banks, the landowners, the construction company, the policymakers, the mayor's office, and the housing institute. We asked them all to jointly play the game and to figure out, how they could produce the best housing. And this was a very productive session where a lot of people, had to think in a very different manner, and actually people could really explain what was at stake. And since this was a success, they said, why don't you guys just do one? Why don't you take one of these sites and show, how we could make such typology work? And so the constraints were, obviously that the budget needed to be very tight. And at the same time, because it was a tight budget, we needed to go up. We couldn't stay at the ground. As there was a real sort of question, can we imagine vertical housing? Because there is such an attachment, so to say, to the ground and to street life in a way. And so what we thought what really deadens this idea of living close to the street is the double-loaded corridor. And obviously on the left you see a diagram, double-loaded corridor, which means there's a corridor in the middle with units on either end, is the most efficient, right? It's the cheapest, it's the most efficient, you have the least amount of envelope, but it's also the one that really kills community and actually removes you really far from the street. And so we started to say, think about, and the climate is luckily very attractive, this idea of a courtyard or maybe 2 courtyards and a circulation that both sort of weaves inside and outside, and the idea that maybe the journey to your home could be one that is sort of more adventurous, more connected, and maybe even where there's a choice to move through. And the second thing we thought is like, housing often becomes very anonymous. You don't know anymore where your home is. So we felt it was a corner site. We need to make something that is sort of, clear and has a say civic presence on the corner, but it's also broken down and not like some sort of massive singular building. And so we thought, what is this? If this is sort of an assembly of different parts in which you can recognize where you live. And in some way, the ambition to make, all unique homes, that every plan is specific, that you know that your home, the home of your neighbor is a little bit different than yours, and that there is sort of an interest there, that you can have something to talk about, not everybody in the same box. And so this is 60 units. Our building budget was $2.5 million to build these 60 units. We had to be very, very thoughtful about how we did it. We also wanted to make a building that didn't need a lot of machines, and the courtyards help a lot with natural ventilation. It also allowed us to have daylight come in from both ends, and the possibility of cross ventilation. And so we made this sinuous sort of plan with an open corridor along, sort of, bringing you to the homes. You enter on the ground floor over here. There's a staircase. There's an additional staircase that takes you up. There are spaces here that we open for communities. So there's places where we don't build the units, but that people can share to gather together. But there was this challenge, obviously, with people walking past your house, so to say. And so we thought we rotate the facade so that you can't look in straight to somebody's unit, but always sort of hit it on the oblique. And we designed initially, because the budget was, there was not much there. We thought we need to prefabricate everything very simple, 2 types of panels, 2 types of windows, and we call it a day. And so this was the design. But very quickly, they tried to work with us, and they tried to say, it's very hard for us actually to do the precast panels. We did a mock-up for you here on the right. Didn't really work. Sort of it fell apart. We cannot do this. And then it became clear that actually they told us, in order to install 1 precast panel, we have to get a truck from Guadalajara. It's 4-hour drive. We have to get it from this one concrete plant that can do it. We have to get the one guy with the crane to install it. And so it takes 30, and for the same cost to install 1 panel means we can have 30 people work for 30 days. And so then what we did is, rather than, depending on the truck, the factory, and the crane, we actually worked with a local manufacturer to develop a block, one sort of cementitious block that is exactly 17 kilos, which is the maximum amount that a single worker is allowed to carry, without needing a crane or any other sort of machine. And so this could be individually carried, and it meant that many more people could participate in building the building. And so rather than precasting these walls, we built them up out of these blocks. We did a mock-up that you see here, and then that's the system which hadn't been used before. It was sort of a custom block we made, but then we used that in a way to make the entire facade. And so here you see it, and you see in that stack there is a little bit of texture, and also the hand really appears, and in that sense it gives actually a much stronger sort of sense of craft and of handmade. In some way, connects it much more to the context and to the surroundings. So here you see it in the weekend. There's markets around the whole site. This is at other days with the entrance here. A few steps up, the ground level units are commercial units and accessible units, and then the higher levels are 3-bedroom and 2-bedroom units. This is the small courtyard. Here you see the big courtyard with the stairs going up. You see one of the communal rooms over here, another one up there, and then there's a roof terrace in there as well. Looking down in a small courtyard, and the staircase in the middle that sort of weaves the 2 courtyards together. Here you see the unit. Obviously, there are some strange corners, but we also feel that there is enough creativity and a craft, so to say. In these units, they will be owned by the people that live there. So we also see that they will manipulate them, paint them, change them, and work on them. But so the facade, and because of the climate is so attractive, is this single stone, and that's both the outside and the inside wall, so to say. Here you see it on the corner in its site, and here in the context, close to the city center, in obviously an area that has been built, informally many decades back, but now is much more part of the center of the town. And it was a prototype, but now there's 2 others of this typology being developed, not by us, but by other offices. And the client here was the city itself, which is quite rare in today's day and age. I'm gonna end with one project that is still sort of in the process of being completed. The official opening date is actually November 15th, but it is 4 buildings, and similar to the other building in France, it has sort of been opening over time as a campus. So some of this is already open, but there's still a few parts that we're still working on and finishing, which is an arts campus, a residency in Bushwick in New York. And so Bushwick is a very industrial area. Maybe people know it. It's also sort of hip, maybe. There's galleries there, and it's sort of the informal and casual city in comparison, removed from Manhattan, if you want. And so our client is somebody who has an arts residency already in Italy and had an interest in providing spaces for artists to work and to just be and to have sort of like a very quiet and not necessarily in the center of Manhattan, but really a place where they could just work and concentrate, come for 3 months, and work on whatever they wanted to work on. And so these are the 3 sites. Actually, this arrow is not completely correct. It's actually right, this white roof over here, but it sort of connects these 3 streets, right, if you want. And so it's not just an architectural problem, it's actually also sort of an urbanistic problem. You see a little bit of context here. There's a mini storage on the left. There's some residential around there, but there's mostly truck body shops. There's a poultry abattoir, and what have you. And so it's not necessarily a community. It's much more sort of a working site where people go into these old warehouses. They do their thing, and then they go out. So there's no real public life to consider. There was one building. This building we reused. It was an old stone shop where you could get tiles and cut slabs. And so the question here was like, how do we create within this sort of quite industrial area a place that is that where one can stay, and in some way, how do we scale down, if you want, the urbanity here that is one that is very loud, a lot of trucks coming through streets. How do we create sort of a place where people can stay, can concentrate, and work? And so I think this project is both sort of an urban problem, and it's also sort of a material problem. It is less so of an architectural problem in the sense that we didn't have to make like very strange form necessarily or anything. There's no interest even in having a lot of people come and visit. It was much more about how do you create really a peaceful and quiet space for people to work. So really an oasis to an extent. We thought the idea of sort of an urbanity that is on the pedestrian scale could be interesting and connecting sort of through the buildings, the block all the way through. This is the existing building that we kept and reused. And then we use sort of courtyards in a way as buffers between the buildings and to create sort of a more intimate space. And we moved the most public programs to the sort of center, deep into the block. So rather than having the public programs at the street, and they are sort of deeper in the block. So the entrances are here, the bookshop and the cafe is over here, the public performance space is deep into the block here, so that anytime that you visit, you actually have to go through these courtyards and through these smaller, say, pedestrian-type alleyways in order to get sort of to the interior. The program so these 2 sites are gallery spaces, and this is the residency space and the performance space. There's no collection, there was no artistic director when we started to design, and so in some way we needed to provide sort of a somewhat flexible, if you want, set of spaces in which artists could work, independent. Or like we couldn't anticipate yet what would happen, and so we gave a variety of spaces. One very large open space gallery, a very intimate gallery, a very tall double high gallery over here, and for the performance space we made 2 rooms that could be accessed on either way. So for instance, there could be a performance here and this could be backstage, or there could be performance here and this could be a foyer where people gather, and then this could function as sort of a green room or vice versa. So all of it was trying to design a set of spaces that allowed for different programs and different occupants to imagine how to use it. And so then the task in a way of these simple boxes is how do we give them a certain expression, a certain agency, and also how do we scale them down to a certain human scale, so to say, because it is sort of an area of just big boxes, and so we thought every elevation needs to have a horizontal datum where there is a change in sort of materiality or in texture. So every elevation, and you'll see they're relatively high buildings. Some are 2 stories, but they have this horizontal datum to bring it closer sort of to the ground. And then we worked on giving a real sort of texture while working with very standard and very sort of industrial materials. So we work with the concrete. You'll see some construction process pictures now, and how we work really with local tradesmen in creating a very, I would say, both simple and robust, but also subtle set of volumes. The challenge was how to create a certain unity between these four different buildings, and at the same time have them have a certain particularity. So the two residential residency projects are made out of cast in place concrete. They have a texture shift, so there's a corrugated concrete on top and a smooth concrete at the level below. We then designed certain particularities to the building. So once the buildings have sort of their base set up with these two materials and these two finishes, we added like particular details that give a sense of orientation. So here, with a little wink to Lina Bobardi, we introduced this potato window that sits there, and as you can see all the way through the site as you walk through on this pedestrian path at the end. For the other building, we worked with a standard brick. It's a cementitious brick that we rotated. It's basically has four different, or there's two smooth sides and two rough sides, and so the pattern actually around the building changes because you either see a fully smooth or a smooth rough or a rough or a rough smooth, so to say. So here we did a little mock-up with the masons of how the stone needed to be installed. Here's the score pattern of the stone. We mocked up every condition, how the doors sit in there, and here you see sort of how that sort of results, and it creates a really interesting effect, of course, with light and shadow as well that changes as it moves around the building. The renovation building, we added a courtyard in front. So this is this storefront you saw before with the stone shop. And what we did here is we rotated the standard brick. So a brick is being extruded if you want out of when you make it, and it has the sort of pattern that you see here. And so by rotating and using the back of the brick, you actually don't see anymore where the different bricks sit, and it sort of it gets unified within that pattern. And lastly, we sort of unified the ground, which is it's like just standard sort of sidewalk material, but we made a custom rake and this custom pattern, and we worked with local concrete guys to create this sort of very almost bespoke, almost like Zen garden like raked pattern that you see now that sort of unifies the entirety of the site and brings sort of that topo together. One more detail, I'm not 100% sure what it's all in here, but this is the last sort of outside terrace for the artists to sit on, and some of the cutoffs of the site we sort of just poured into the concrete almost as if there is like a almost post-apocalyptic, so to say, condition, if you want, in which all these things were sort of embedded within that site. So here, a few pictures just to end today's talk, walking you from the Grand Street entrance in this courtyard. You see the brick pattern sort of change from the outside to the inside. The floor pattern continues. This is sort of a lobby before you get into the gallery space. After the gallery, there's a corridor, there's the bookshop and the cafe, which is really a great bookshop, a great resource. Maybe I missed some pictures, but basically the bookshop here is on the left. You come into this one courtyard. Oh yeah, here we are looking back at the bookshop and the cafe in that courtyard where you can come and eat. The second building where the offices are on the higher level and this double high volume is there. These are the offices on the second floor. A big marquee in a way for the entrance here to the left, which you can see from the street. And this, coming out towards the street and turning around, seeing the residency building with the wink to Lina Bobardi. You see the soft sort of the wall just turning a little bit to mark the entrance into the courtyard. And I think that's here you see the courtyard. I think there's a few more pictures, but I think that's where I'm going to leave the conversation at today. So thank you, and Todd, I hope you can come back on screen and let us know what we're going to talk about. Thank you.
All right. Well, that was amazing, Florian. It's always such a treat to hear you talk about your work. And there are a lot of ways that I can go. One thing I want to point out is just how much more there is. And I want, particularly the students who are watching, but whoever's watching, I mean, it's such a tiny slice through the work that you and Jing have done was shown tonight, and I really, I want to commend the, I don't know what to call it, the confidence maybe, I mean, you guys have done some really astonishing projects, the building at UC Davis, the museum at UC Davis, the museum in Korea, the incredible shopping center in Hong Kong. I mean, these are like shiny, fancy, award-winning, like killer stuff. And what I really appreciate about the way that you approached the talk tonight is that it was in no way a victory lap. I mean, you're like, we're working on stuff and here's some of it. And, I just want to show it to you. And so the enthusiasm really comes through, and the energy of the practice really comes through. So I just want to point out like how much more is there. And I think that tendency not to take the victory lap really speaks to how you and Jing seem to operate. I don't know you guys super well, but we've kind of hung out here and there over the past 10 or 12 years or so. And you can see it in the presentation. I mean, you begin with this question of elasticity, of flexibility. You kind of approach the projects not with an idea that you're going to impose on that project, but with a real curiosity about what the opportunities might be. And maybe we could start there to kind of talk about how you approach the projects, because one of the things that you don't hear in your presentation is a kind of big idea that defines the practice, right? I think there are certain trends or habits that you can identify through the work. I think there's an incredible consistency to the way that you approach projects, but it doesn't have the kind of, you don't present it with a kind of intellectual apparatus against which we're supposed to judge it. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. I mean, there's a kind of refreshing pragmatism about the way that you approach these projects that I think is worth chatting about a little bit.
I think it's very important to recognize the fact that this practice is one that comes out of a dialogue, which is not rooted in a single spot, so to say. So it's not, we're not from a certain school, we're not from a certain country. I mean, we are from countries, but we're not, we're not like, we cannot we don't use our roots, our cultural roots, so to say, to articulate, a legacy or something that we come out of to an extent. And I think the fact that I left a place that had a very strong, set of especially when it was there in the 90s, Dutch design, was like the thing, so to say. And I think and Jing, her journey from, really growing up in communist China in Nanjing and actually, ending up, studying at Tulane and then ending up in New York. I think both of us have always been driven by a curiosity sort of to understand something that we are not part of, so to say, right? So we've always been curious, not to understand, because I think it's very hard to understand something that you're not part of. And I also think we're living in a very interesting time, in almost a time where we're not allowed to understand something that we're not part of, so to say, right? Because we have not been part of something. And that's I think what is interesting about sort of the work that Jing and I do is that it very much sort of evolves out of a curiosity and a dialogue. And not just a dialogue between us, but also a dialogue with, the people for whom this project is, and also the people who will be constructing this project. So I think in that sense, our role is not to impose, something from a certain, point of view or point of, a school of thought, but it's really to engage, right, in a process in which we learn, in which we also bring things, but where we together, find response to a particular question. And so I think we've also looked at the people that seek us out or that we end up working with. And those are always often people who also don't know the answer, so to say. So for instance, the housing in Mexico, they knew that something needed to happen. They didn't know what needed to happen, right? Or they didn't know how to get there, so to say. The last thing we did, this Amant Arts Foundation, was somebody with an intuition and a desire, but no solution. There was no program. There was nothing was actually given, and it was really sort of embarking. And these are a few things, but there's many examples where we end up with somebody who realizes that something needs to happen, something needs to change, but they're not certain about it, and then they find sort of maybe confidence or an interest in the way we approach it, because it is something that is not like, there's architects, what it's going to look like, right? It doesn't matter where it is and what it's going to be, what it's going to be. You know what it's going to be. It's just going to have a different name on it. And I think in our case, you don't know what it's going to be. Sometimes it hurts us, right? Because there's a lot of people that don't know, and they want to know what they're getting. With us, you get a process, but you don't know what it's going to be necessarily.
Yeah. Well, in one of the monographs you talk, and you've talked about this in other contexts as well, you talk about you and Jing being foreigners, right? Yeah. They kind of living in New York, but you're not from there. And one of the things that struck me as you were describing this process is that in some way you approach a project and you're often asked to produce a project by clients who are kind of foreigners in their own project. Yeah. Each of the projects that you showed tonight have a kind of post-industrial context, right? What does it mean to work in Niagara Falls 80 years after Robert Moses? What does it mean to work in Meisenthal after the glass factory is gone, in Lyon after the auto manufacturing industry has transformed? Or even the kind of rehabilitation of the spaces in New York for the Art Center. And so in some sense, the way that you and Jing describe living in New York as, that as a foreigner, you can practice with a kind of expertise and naivete. You can kind of make mistakes, and there's a kind of a level of, you have to, because like certain things you just don't quite know how it goes. But somehow these contexts that you're working in, it's kind of everyone is in that space. Like, what do I do with this big building that no longer has the purpose that it once had? And I think that it speaks to the flexibility. It's the flexibility of an outsider. How can we kind of figure out a situation that isn't ours, that we're not trying to control every aspect of, to kind of work with what's already there. And is that something that you think, has that developed through the course of the practice? Do you see differences in the way that you approached earlier projects to the way that the office is working now, or has that been a fairly consistent attitude?
I think the idea, it's interesting because so what is interesting, I think, is that we have not had a repeat client, let's say, or we have not had a repeat ask, if you know what I mean. So, we've so if you want to see our projects, you have to go to California, Korea, Mexico, and northern France, so to say. So we've done, and they are all different types of buildings built by different, groups of people. And so that idea that we are really excited about is to go into a place in a context where we don't know what it's going to be. And so we're continuing in a way to do that. We're finding people we can work with on things we have never done before. So this idea that you have to repeat yourself, that is something that we haven't, that we're not necessarily doing. Maybe we're making now our second house or something, but I don't, what I mean? But all of these things are still, we're pretty much starting from scratch in a new jurisdiction, in a new thing. And so that energy is very much there. At the same time, what I think we became better at is understanding where in the project can we push, right? Where can we, and I think we are quite optimistic in a sense that we always feel that there is a place where we can do something that hasn't been done before. And I think we became better at locating that place early on in the project. So what can we push? and where do we just have to listen and learn, so to say, and figure out how it's done. So I think that that's something where maybe that, I don't know if it has changed, but I was trying to show also by showing sort of the beginning and the impulse, and then what we're doing on now, is that our projects are more complex, that there are more people involved, that there are more voices to hear, so to say, and that we are trying to actually incorporate all those histories and maybe all those narratives into the projects themselves as well. So I think the scale, like our sort of our need to be elastic, we have to be. I think maybe we got more agile even, or more flexible. I'm not sure, but I mean that's maybe one of the things that has helped as well.
Well, I think another term that comes up in discussions about your work, or that you've brought up, is tolerance.
Yeah.
And
at OSU, I think that was my talk at OSU, was tolerance.
Oh, is that right? Maybe that's why it kind of sticks in my mind. But you talk about the that you have to come at a project with a certain acceptance. You're not going to be able to change it all. Like you're kind of stuck with certain aspects. And what's, again, I think a really, really instructive about the way that your practice operates is that you can work with what's there in a way that doesn't seem like you're being oppressed by what's there. That you find opportunities. And so
I think I can just add, like, just as an example, I can give you an example for the housing in Mexico. There was first the idea to align everything perfect between all the floors, right? And then we said, no, we're not going to try to align anything perfect. We're going to try to misalign everything as much as we can, so that we don't, so the whole idea of the development of that skin or the facade, basically, and the way we organized it, was that it allowed for a lot of noise, and we let the sun and the shadow do the work rather than trying sort of perfection. So that's one example to that. Sorry, go on.
And I think that's a great way to think about it. I mean, one of the things that immediately comes to my mind when I think about the term tolerance is construction tolerances.
Yeah.
Right. That you have to allow a certain amount of wiggle room in the way that things come together, and the way that in some of the earlier projects that involve kind of wrappers and kind of flexible skins.
Yeah.
You kind of open up that gap between how things come together. So a 1/4 inch framing tolerance is not really a concern, but you can kind of open that up. What happens if the tolerance is 3 feet?
Yeah.
And that there's a social or a political aspect to that as well. That the programs, you seem to work toward a kind of looseness of program, that you don't want to script every square inch of the project, but you actually want to leave open-ended the way that the project is used. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you bring a client along in those conversations, because I think that sometimes a client will have a fairly specific attitude and a limited amount of funds, and so how do you find ways to kind of stretch?
It doesn't mean that the stretch doesn't mean that the budget has to stretch necessarily, but so I think, well, and I like to, this is one of the maybe things I'm continuing to repeat over time, but a program is currency, right? Program is currency that buys you space, meaning if a client writes a program, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually going to do that thing that they write down in that thing, but it gives them something to hold on to. They said 50 of this, 100 of this, 200 of this. And then we can put a number, 50 of this at this amount. It's like a shopping list that allows you to buy space. Nobody ever uses the space the way it's written in the program. It's a very useful currency to buy you space, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be used that way. And then there's a lot of people who don't really know yet how they're going to be using the space, but they know that something will happen in some way or the other. Then there's quite specific things. The way you blow glass, like the way you have to organize a hot shop and like a bench, that's been sort of developed over time, and there's actually quite some simple things. So I think we and luckily maybe now we are comfortable enough to sort of have an honest conversation to show how spaces can be used in different ways, but also realizing that having a little bit of tolerance gives the client or gives the person, the user, some sort of flexibility. And the other thing that I think we realized, and this is maybe similar to what I said before, of like, where do you push? If you look at the gallery in Korea, which is very simple brief, a white cube to show art, right? That's it. And there was even simpler, the biggest white cube that is allowed to show art, right? So we knew what that box was going to be. We weren't going to change that box necessarily, right? We said all the experimentation happens in the space between the box and the context. Everything is that negotiation, and which is maybe where the tolerance is the most needed, right? This was like ubiquitous, full white art space that needed to be inserted in a very sensitive historical context. So it is in that zone in between where the push and pull needs to happen. And so we meet sort of literally our client. That was our first building we needed to build. We were going to weld like 500,000 rings together. Our client just asked, if you fail, will I fail? Right? And I said, no, you will have your box. You can do your shows. We would have failed. And so that, I mean, luckily and I think at that moment, obviously that gives you an incredible amount of confidence, and you don't realize how grateful I was for the confidence we got at that moment, because that obviously builds up, and then you can do a few more, and then that gives you some sort of space to operate in.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say, you've come back to this a couple of times tonight. Where can you push? Is kind of how you're thinking. But I think also when I look at the projects completed, I can also see that there's also the aspect of where do you allow yourself to be pushed? Yeah. Where do you relent in order to allow other possibilities to emerge? It's not every architect who is going to allow a group of clients to make a bunch of models. Like that's a fairly risky proposition for a certain kind of architectural attitude. And so I think, that there is pushing, and I know, you guys are very wily in the way that you're able to find opportunities that maybe aren't so immediately obvious. But at the same time, I think that there is a kind of willingness to follow other possibilities that you didn't have going in, like whether they come from the client or whether they come from the constraints of the situation, whether they come from, working with the Tuscaroras people in Niagara Falls, for instance, that you seem to kind of invite players in a way that is not always the case with architects. And I think that that's a really impressive, and again, that's not always a way of working that's going to lead to a coherent body of work, but at the same time, your work has a kind of very clear consistency. It's not a house style, you're not Richard Meyer, but there is a, you kind of know a soil project when you see one. And I find that kind of,
what is funny? I mean, one of the things that we felt very early on, and I think, the PS1 installation in very many ways embodies a lot of what came afterwards, right? There is the grid, but it is pliable and it can collapse. And I think we were just thinking of, what do we do as architects? In a way, if you hire an architect, right, the idea is that 5 years later, the world is a better place, right? You get brought on board, you go through a process, and then it is better. But, we were doing this right at the moment of the financial collapse. The whole world was sort of coming into pieces. Even if you're educated and even if you can sort of make this argument, that's very hard to tell a client, yes, it's going to be fine 5 years from now and it's going to be better than today, right? So then it is like, how can we actually find a project in the process? Because often what happens is you design something, and then over the process, it gets worse and worse and worse, right? It gets further removed from the thing that you promised in the second month, so to say. But at the moment that you allow for this tolerance and you allow for the project to become smarter, so to say, or to accommodate more, right? It can become richer. It can have another story. It's like, for instance, the stone, the block in Mexico was 100 times better instead of if we had insisted that it needed to be precast panels, right? And it is like, oh, I get it, right? We have to think of this differently, and it gets better at that moment. And so I think that's where we are. I mean, I don't know. It's maybe indeed It's the way you have to figure things out as you go. And I think a lot of it has probably still to do with the fact that we moved, you know, to different places, and you have to just figure it out as you go. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. It's funny that you know, I've seen your practice compared in ways. You know, Muhammad in his essay talks about the resonance with the Smithsons, right? And the kind of dirty realism of the new brutalists that he sees echoed in your work. And then Zaina, not so long ago, talking about the resonance with Charles and Ray Eames and the way that, you know, that practice works. Venturi and Scott Brown come up. But what I would throw in there is not another, you know, couple practice, but rather something similar in the way that you're speaking that sounds to me weirdly like Charles Moore. And your work doesn't look anything like Moore, but your process does. And I think similarly Moore's inclusivity, you know, his real desire to kind of accommodate the people that he was working for. And I think he too wanted to, you know, make sure that the world was a better place 5 years later. But I wonder what you think about that. I mean, is Moore somebody you...
It's very interesting. No, well, I would have to read more about him, literally. I mean, I think the first time I encountered his work was when, you know, Jing was studying at Tulane in New Orleans, and it was all beat up and, like, you know, laid into shambles. Was it Piazza Romana? No, I think it's called. Or what's the name again? Yeah, right.
The Piazza d'Italia.
Yeah, the Italia. Sorry, yeah, that one. So that was you know, in the back of. I mean, it was very fascinating. But I will say, now that you say this, I'm going to read more of what he spoke about, because obviously I know his work and I know, you know, the projects he did. But I have not read much around his theory and the way he actually spoke about this work. I do know that at some point he had an office in every town. No, I mean, that was.
Yeah, I mean, he had that kind of itinerant lifestyle that I think the two of you in some ways lead. So we're running a little bit late. So you and I could circle back on the Charles Moore question some other time.
I'm going to look it up. We're going to talk about it next time when you invite me in person. We're going to follow up on that. Yeah.
Sure. So well, before we go, I've got a question here from the chat. And so this is from Nun Kugbik, one of our G3 students. See, he's getting at your cleverness. Just because your presentation contained the word soil in 2 of the 4 projects and in your firm name, what do you mean by it? How many layers of meaning hover around in that name?
I think there's four ideas that went into that name. Obviously, soil is one. Then soil, I already spoke about. Then there is solid objectives, Idenburg Liu, and that actually has 2 in them, which is the solid objectives, which is that we are interested in solidifying objectives, so to say. So not paper architecture and not just building stuff, but, you know, how do we transform an idea into matter, right? And then the ill is Idenburg and Liu, and it has to do indeed with this dual author, so to say, and the you know, the idea that and we took away, like, we went from solid objectives, Idenburg, Liu, to soil, because it's actually not just me and Jing, but it's, you know, obviously a larger office that we're working with. And so that's you know, a number of the thoughts behind it. And I will say, I think the M dash in between is a very important one as well. That's maybe the tolerance or the space that's created. It's not a hyphen, it's an M dash. It's a little bit more tolerance than the tight hyphen. So.
Well, if it grows to an M dash, we know that you're.
I know. Then we get. That's when we get a little bit old, thought.
Well, so I would happily keep on going. I know, you know, Zoom kind of starts wearing on us all after an hour or so, and we've been running a little longer than that. So I think this would be a good place to wrap it up. But Florian, thanks so much. It was really great to see the work. It's so much fun to talk to you, and cool. I look forward to seeing you in person very soon.
Yeah, for sure.
Until then, thank you again, and thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Excellent. Thanks so much.